the 2nd of December, 2022, Liberty County, Georgia. Winter had arrived without ceremony across this stretch of the Georgia coastal plain, a flat, quiet landscape of longleaf pine and dark creek water where the roads thin out and the tree lines close in fast. The Portal Hunting Club sits several miles from the nearest highway, its grounds spreading across the border of Liberty and McIntosh counties, acres of dense woodland that most people never have reason to enter. On that Friday morning, a group of hunters moved through the underbrush on what should have been an unremarkable day. What they found instead would set in motion one of the most disturbing investigations the state of Georgia had seen in years. Scattered among the leaf litter and low scrub, they came across human remains, not the whole of a person fragments, parts of a body, deliberately separated and distributed across a wide area. Investigators with the Liberty County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation responded to the scene and began the grim process of recovery. Over the following days, additional remains were located within a 3-mile radius of the initial discovery site, a detail that spoke not to chaos, but to deliberate, methodical intent. Whoever left her there had taken their time. The victim was a white female, brown eyes, brown hair, shoulder length, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10. She wore a dark blue long-sleeve Merona shirt, a white camisole, and gray shorts. There were no tattoos, no visible scars, no piercings, nothing that could immediately anchor her to a name. The only potential lead forensic specialist could identify was a single dental implant in her upper right jaw, the kind of medical hardware that sometimes carries a traceable record. The GBI's medical examiner estimated her death had occurred approximately 1 to 2 weeks before discovery, placing her likely final days somewhere in the latter half of November 2022. A search through missing persons databases across Georgia and neighboring states returned nothing of value. No one, it seemed, had reported this woman missing. On December 13th, 11 days after the discovery, the GBI released a forensic facial reconstruction and appealed to the public for help. The image showed a woman with balanced, even features the kind of face you might pass in a grocery store and not look twice at. It was broadcast across local news and shared through law enforcement channels. And for weeks it produced nothing conclusive. Somewhere out there, someone knew this woman, someone had last seen her alive, but no call came, at least not immediately. And the reason no one had reported her missing was a detail that investigators did not yet understand. Because this woman had not simply disappeared, she had already been declared dead. What the GBI did not yet know, what no one involved in the investigation could have anticipated at that stage, was that the answer to their question was not sitting in a missing persons file. It was buried inside a trail of fabricated emails, a manufactured death, and a second life being quietly assembled hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania. Before her name could be recovered, it first had to be believed. Pennsylvania. Late December 2022, a woman named Heather Thomas was watching local news coverage when the forensic sketch appeared on her screen. The image, a woman with brown hair and balanced features, stopped her cold because Heather recognized that face. And the reason her recognition carried such weight was not simply familiarity. It was the direct collision between what she was seeing and what she had already been told. According to the man she had once been married to, this woman was already dead, had been for weeks. Had passed away quietly in a medical facility in Savannah, Georgia, from sudden health complications. There had been no funeral, no public announcement, no obituary. Just a story, delivered by a man named Nicholas Kassotis, and accepted in the absence of any reason to doubt it. Heather contacted the Liberty County Sheriff's Department within days of the composite sketch airing. She identified the woman in the reconstruction as Mindi Mebane Kassotis, the second wife of her former husband Nicholas. That single phone call rewrote the entire premise of the investigation, The unidentified woman in the Georgia woods was not a stranger. She was someone with a name, a history, and a family who had been told she was already gone. But to understand why Heather's call carried the particular weight that it did, you have to understand what connected her to Nicholas Kassotis in the first place. Their divorce had been finalized in 2015, and the court had ordered Nicholas to pay Heather approximately $1.5 million as part of the settlement. He had not paid, not a portion of it. Instead, he had effectively dissolved, cutting off communication, concealing his location, and continuing to move while the debt accumulated and the legal consequences compounded. By the time Heather saw that sketch on her television screen, law enforcement had already issued an active warrant for Nicholas's arrest related to his violations of the divorce agreement and his failure to comply with the court's financial ruling. Heather had spent the better part of 2 years trying to track him. She had hired a contact training to be a private investigator. She had followed fragments of information, South Carolina, then something about Georgia. She had been preparing herself, she later said, for anything. What she could not have prepared for was this. Detectives moved quickly. They began contacting hospitals across Georgia and neighboring states, searching for any record of Mindi Kassotis being admitted, treated, or pronounced deceased during the time frame Nicholas had described. The search was exhaustive. The result was absolute. No hospital had any record of a patient by that name. No physician had signed a death certificate. No medical facility had logged an admission. Mindi Kassotis had not died from a stroke or any other illness. She had not died in Savannah. She had simply ceased to exist in any official record at precisely the moment Nicholas began telling people she was gone. The absence of paperwork was its own kind of evidence, but what investigators uncovered next would suggest that this erasure had not been improvised. It had been constructed carefully, deliberately, and with a level of forethought that pointed towards something far more calculated than a man covering his tracks in a panic. Because Nicholas Kassotis, it turned out, was also dead. While detectives were still processing the absence of any hospital record for Mindi, a separate detail surfaced that reframed the entire investigation. Nicholas Kassotis, according to messages received by his own friends and family in late 2022, was also dead. The story delivered to those closest to him described a fatal automobile accident, sudden, tragic, and final. There had been no police report filed. No accident record existed in any county database. No death certificate had been issued in any state. The man who had told everyone his wife died in a Savannah hospital had simultaneously arranged for word to reach his own circle that he too had perished. 2 deaths. 2 stories. 0 documentation. Investigators now understood they were not dealing with a man who had panicked after something went wrong. The scale of what Nicholas had constructed, parallel, fabricated deaths, coordinated messaging, timed delivery to separate social circles, required planning. It required the kind of deliberate, sequence thinking that does not emerge from impulse. Every person who mattered had been handed a version of events that made further inquiry feel unnecessary. There was nothing left to search for, because there was no one left to find. The picture became even more devastating when detectives contacted Mindi's parents, Frank and Betsy Mebane. They had not seen their daughter in several years, but they had been hearing from her. Regular emails had arrived describing her life, the constant movement, the health concerns, a growing sense of physical decline. In the most recent messages, Mindi had described serious illness and hospitalization. Then came correspondence that appeared to originate from medical personnel, detailing her deteriorating condition in clinical language. Her parents had accepted the account of her death with the particular grief of people who had been slowly prepared for it. Nicholas had even provided an explanation for why there could be no funeral unspecified bureaucratic complications, he told them. They had mourned without a burial, without a ceremony, without the basic closure that comes from being allowed to say goodbye in person. Betsy Mebane later described the moment Nicholas called to tell her that Mindi had suffered a stroke and was not coming home. She wept, recounting it in court. A mother who had believed her daughter was ill, who had watched from a distance as those emails described a life slipping away, who never once considered that the illness was fiction, because why would she? Nicholas had given her no reason to question it and every reason to accept it. The emails had been detailed, the language had been convincing, and the man delivering the news had once been someone she trusted. Investigators collected DNA samples from the Mebane family for forensic comparison against the remains recovered from the Portal Hunting Club. While those biological samples moved through the laboratory process, analysts turned their attention to Nicholas's digital footprint. What they found was immediate and significant. The man whose death had been reported to his friends and family was still financially active. Bank transactions were still occurring. Movement across state lines was still being recorded. He was not dead. He was not even hiding particularly well. He had simply assumed that the story he had told was airtight enough to buy him permanent distance. That assumption would prove to be the first and most consequential miscalculation of his new life, because the digital trail he left behind did not go cold. It went north, straight to a quiet suburban address in Pennsylvania, where Nicholas Kassotis had already become someone else entirely. The financial activity and movement patterns analysts were tracking converged on Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. There, in a residential neighborhood unremarkable in every visible way, lived a man whose physical description matched Nicholas Kassotis precisely. He was not going by that name. He had legally restructured his identity around a new one, Nicholas Killian James Stark. The choice of surname was not accidental. Stark was a direct reference to Tony Stark, the Marvel Comics character better known as Iron Man, a billionaire, a genius, a man of dangerous secrets operating at the edge of government and technology, misunderstood by the world but ultimately heroic. Nicholas had not simply selected a name to hide behind, he had selected a mythology to inhabit. His new wife was a writer. She had met Nicholas during a period when, by his own account, he was a widower, a man who had endured the quiet devastation of losing his wife to illness and was slowly rebuilding. He presented himself with the particular gravity of someone who had suffered and survived. The story was coherent. The grief was performed convincingly enough. They had married, settled into a home in Lancaster County, and were building toward a future together, a family, permanence, roots. She had no reason to believe that any part of the man she had married was constructed. She did not know his real name. She did not know about Mindi. She did not know that at the very moment Nicholas had begun pursuing her, his second wife was still alive. That timeline, once investigators established it, became one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Nicholas had not waited for Mindi's death before beginning his next chapter. The courtship had already been underway. The new identity had already been assembled. By the time Mindi's remains were left in the Georgia woodland, Nicholas had somewhere to go, someone waiting, a life already in progress, under a name borrowed from a fictional hero. When a task force arrived in Lancaster County on the 12th of May, 2023, they moved with the kind of precision that comes from months of careful preparation. The arrest was made the following day, May 13th. Officers surrounded the property and took Nicholas Kassotis into custody on a quiet street that had, until that morning, been simply where he lived. For a man who had spent months engineering distance between himself and the events of late November 2022, the confrontation arrived with the particular quality of all things that have been inevitable from the beginning, sudden in execution, long in coming. During a search of the home, investigators recovered documents bearing his real name hidden among the belongings of his new household, along with electronic devices that would later prove critical to the prosecution's case. His new wife's world collapsed in a single morning. The man she had married as a grieving widower was a fugitive. The loss he had described so carefully had been manufactured. The secrecy she had perhaps attributed to trauma or private grief was something else entirely. She had been living, without knowing it, inside the same architecture of deception that had ultimately consumed Mindi, just at an earlier stage, just before it had a chance to close around her. One day before the arrest, on the 11th of May 2023, the DNA results from the Mebane family samples had returned from the laboratory. The biological comparison was conclusive. The remains found at the Portal Hunting Club in Riceboro, Georgia, scattered across 3 miles of woodland, left without identification, without documents, without any thread connecting them to a living person, belonged to Mindi Mebane Kassotis. She had a name again. And the man who had taken it from her was already in handcuffs. Before any of this, before the Georgia woodland, before the fabricated illness, before the hotel rooms and the encrypted messages and the years of engineered fear, there was just Mindi Mebane, a woman her former professor William Doherty described as someone you wish you could fill an entire classroom with, bright, driven, funny in the way that draws people toward you rather than performing for them. She had studied political science at Armstrong Atlantic State University in Savannah, where Doherty remembered her as vibrant and excited about everything, a student who attacked ideas rather than simply absorbing them. She earned a master's degree in public and international affairs. Then she moved to Washington, D.C., where she built a career as a legal secretary and began laying the groundwork for something larger. Her friends Angela Wynn and Morgan Paddock knew her as a woman who led with warmth and operated with intention. She wanted to tell stories that mattered. She wanted to amplify voices that deserved a wider audience. That impulse became the Compelling Women podcast, a platform she created, wrote, and hosted herself, dedicated to in-depth conversations with women doing extraordinary things. It was not a vanity project. It was a genuine expression of who she was, someone who believed other people's stories were worth the effort of being told well. Morgan Paddock, who appeared on the podcast herself, described it simply beautiful and special, and like talking to a friend who happened to have a platform and wanted to use it for good. She met Nicholas Kassotis in 2015 on a dating app, shortly after his divorce from Heather Thomas was finalized. He was a JAG officer, a military attorney with service that had taken him through the Pentagon to bases in Italy and Iraq. He came with credentials, with bearing, with the particular authority that accumulates around someone who has spent years operating in spaces most people never access. For Mindi, Angela Wynn later said, it felt like a fairy tale ending coming to fruition. They married in 2016. Her friends watched her settle into a happiness that seemed complete, a partner, a shared future, plans for a family, and a creative life that was gaining momentum. Even Heather Thomas, Nicholas's first wife, said she had been genuinely pleased for them both when the relationship began. The shift, when it came, arrived gradually enough that it never announced itself as a shift at all. Nicholas began constructing the threat narrative around 2020, drawing on the specific texture of his military background to make it feel credible. He spoke about enemies of the state, about compromised financial systems, about the danger of being visible. And because Mindi knew his history, the Pentagon assignments, the overseas deployments, the classified adjacency of JAG work, the story had internal consistency. It did not sound like fantasy. It sounded like the life she had married into, finally revealing its stakes. Bit by bit, her world contracted. No smartphone with GPS, no standard banking, cash only from sources Nicholas controlled, hotels and short-term rentals instead of a permanent home, the encrypted Signal app instead of ordinary calls, aliases when checking into accommodation. Morgan Paddock recalled that the only way she could reach Mindi in those final years was through Signal, that the woman who had once been so openly, freely present in her friends' lives had become someone you had to reach through a specific channel at specific times, with the awareness that even that connection was monitored. In emails to friends in 2021, Mindi herself described her existence as something out of a novel, a real-life spy thriller, she called it. She believed it completely. She had been given no framework for doubting it. By the autumn of 2022, the machinery Nicholas had built around her was beginning to strain. Money was running low. The threat narrative required constant maintenance. And Mindi, whose intelligence and independence had never fully disappeared beneath the weight of what had been done to her, had begun to suggest that they seek outside help, that they find a way back to something normal, that they surface. For a man carrying active arrest warrants and a debt he had no intention of honoring, surfacing was not an option. That autumn, they moved to Savannah. It would be the last city Mindi Kassotis ever lived in. Her former professor said that when he eventually followed the news coverage of the unidentified remains found in Georgia before her name was known, he was struck by one thing. There was nothing about her except what had been done to her. And he thought, that's not right. That doesn't tell anybody who she was or what she was like. It does not. So before this documentary moves into the evidence that convicted the man who killed her, before the surveillance footage and the forensic analysis and the blood-stained interior of a truck driven north through the dark, it is worth sitting for a moment with the version of Mindi Kassotis that existed before any of this. The woman with the podcast and the master's degree and the laugh her friends still talk about, that woman was real. What happened to her in late November 2022 does not change that. It only makes it matter more. By mid-2023, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and Liberty County prosecutors had spent months reconstructing the final days of November 2022 inches, precise, granular detail. They had transaction records, they had GPS data, they had laboratory results, and they had surveillance footage of a man who believed he had been careful enough. What emerged from that reconstruction was not a portrait of panic or disorganization. It was a portrait of premeditation, methodical, sequenced, and executed by someone who understood forensic investigation well enough to attempt to defeat it. On the 23rd of November, 2022, Nicholas Kassotis visited a Home Depot store. Interior surveillance footage captured him moving through the tool section with the unhurried deliberateness of someone running an ordinary errand. He was wearing a cap and a dark jacket. He drew no attention from other customers. The receipt from that visit documented his purchases: a hunting knife with a bright orange handle, a set of protective coveralls, and a deer processing kit, a specialized collection of saws engineered for cutting through dense biological material, including bone. He paid and left. Nothing about the transaction, on its surface, looked like anything other than a man preparing for a hunting trip. Forensic toolmark examiner Lauren Satcher of the GBI later testified about what she found when she analyzed the recovered remains from the Portal Hunting Club. The cut patterns on Mindi's bones were precise and consistent, the work of fine-toothed instruments used with deliberate pressure. The characteristics of those markings were consistent with the type of saws contained in the deer processing kit Nicholas had purchased 4 days before the remains were deposited in the woods. Additionally, microscopic particles of orange-colored plastic were recovered at the recovery site. Laboratory analysis confirmed the material was chemically consistent with the handle of the knife purchased at Home Depot that same afternoon. Cell phone location data dismantled what remained of Nicholas's alibi with particular finality. His device placed him not in Savannah during the critical window of November 24th and 25th, but deep within the woodland area of the Portal Hunting Club in Liberty County, the precise location where Mindi's remains would be found by hunters 8 days later. The signal lingered at that location for a duration, suggesting he was not passing through. He was working. His vehicle, a Ford Explorer, was independently tracked to the same route and the same destination through GPS records that he had not disabled. At trial, prosecutors walked the jury through that route in detail, every turn documented, every timestamp recorded. The browser history recovered from Nicholas's devices added another layer that no alibi could absorb. In the days preceding the trip to the woods, search queries had been entered that spoke directly to the nature of what he was planning. Investigators recovered searches relating to rates of decomposition in specific soil conditions, methods of concealing identity through dismemberment, and information about dental implant databases, the precise vulnerability that would eventually lead to Mindi's identification. A man with a legal education and a military background, running searches designed to anticipate and defeat the forensic investigation he expected would follow. When investigators applied luminol to the interior of Nicholas's Ford Explorer, the vehicle he had driven from Georgia to Pennsylvania, they found what thorough cleaning had failed to erase. Extensive biological traces reacted to the chemical across the cargo area and interior surfaces. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Mindi Kassotis. The vehicle that had carried Nicholas north into his new life had first carried something else south into the dark of Liberty County. Beyond the truck, a storage bin recovered on the hunting club property also tested positive for traces of Mindi's blood. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Keith Lehman, testified to the severity of Mindi's injuries: 9 separate lacerations to the head, a skull fracture, chest and abdominal trauma, and evidence of defensive wounds. She had not been passive in her final moments. She had fought. The electronic devices seized from the Lancaster County home completed the picture. Investigators traced the emails impersonating medical staff, the messages received by Mindi's parents describing her hospitalization and declined to devices in Nicholas's possession, the fabricated correspondence written to prevent a search and to manufacture grief in the people most likely to look for her, had been composed and sent by the same man now sitting in a Pennsylvania jail cell, insisting he had nothing to do with any of it. Every piece of physical evidence pointed in a single direction. Every digital record confirmed the same timeline. Every attempt Nicholas had made to clean, conceal, or distance himself from what happened in that Georgia woodland had left behind exactly the kind of trace that forensic science exists to find. He had studied the law for decades. He had worked adjacent to intelligence operations. He understood, better than most, how investigations are built. And still, the evidence was comprehensive enough that when he finally walked into a courtroom to face it, there was only one story left available to him. It was the strangest one yet, and it would be the last. Inside the interrogation room, Nicholas Kassotis did not collapse. He did not confess. He did not offer the investigators sitting across from him anything resembling an acknowledgement of what the evidence had already established. Instead, he did what he had always done when reality pressed too close. He produced a narrative. This one centered on a man named Jim McIntyre, whom Nicholas described as a government operative, a handler of sorts, someone who had been guiding the couple's movements and directing their decisions for years. According to Nicholas, McIntyre had informed him that Mindi died at a medical facility. According to Nicholas, McIntyre had instructed him to change his identity and relocate. According to Nicholas, the forces responsible for what happened to his wife were external, invisible, and powerful enough to manufacture evidence against an innocent man. Detectives who sat through those interviews later described pushing back hard against the McIntyre account, calling it, in a second recorded interview played for the jury at trial, a web of lies. Nicholas did not deviate. He had constructed the Jim McIntyre figure with the same patience and internal consistency he had used to build every other fiction in his life. McIntyre was never identified. No record of his existence emerged from any government database. No corroborating witness could place him in any of the locations Nicholas described. He was, investigators concluded, the final character in a story Nicholas had been writing for years, a story in which he was never the villain, always the man caught in circumstances beyond his control, always the one being acted upon rather than acting. At trial, which proceeded in Liberty County before a Superior Court Judge Paul Rose in August 2025, prosecutors methodically presented the full architecture of the case: the Home Depot footage, the GPS trail, the luminol results, the browser searches, the fabricated emails traced to his own devices. Nicholas Kassotis took the stand in his own defense, becoming the sole witness called by the defense team. He told the jury he had not killed Mindi. He told them he had not dismembered her body or transported her remains to the Portal Hunting Club. He acknowledged buying the knife, the coveralls, and the deer processing kit. He acknowledged that his phone had been tracked to Liberty County. He said he had turned his cell phone off for approximately 2 hours on the morning of November 29th on the advice of Jim McIntyre for his own safety. He said he had believed Mindi was pregnant at the time of her death. The GBI's autopsy had already confirmed she was not. The jury deliberated and returned quickly. On the 14th of August 2025, Nicholas Kassotis was found guilty on all 12 counts: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, tampering with evidence, and removal of body parts from the scene of death or dismemberment, among others. The verdict was unanimous. Sentencing followed immediately. Judge Paul Rose, before delivering the sentence, addressed Nicholas directly. He told him that he had created a fake world to control his wife, that his life had been a fiction, and that he had used that fiction to carry out what the judge called a brutal, horrific, gruesome murder. Nicholas Kassotis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years. His mother addressed the court during the sentencing hearing and told the room that the jury had gotten it wrong. Nicholas sat without visible reaction as the clerk read each charge and pronounced the verdict. The former JAG officer, the man who had stood in Pentagon corridors and advised on matters of military law, who had served in Iraq and Italy and presented himself to a new wife as a heroic figure navigating invisible dangers, received his sentence and was taken from the courtroom. Mindi's family spoke too. Her sister-in-law, Mindi Mebane, looked directly at Nicholas and told him he had no remorse for what he had done, that he deserved to sit in prison for the rest of his life and think about Mindi every day. Betsy Mebane, who had wept on the witness stand recounting the phone call in which Nicholas told her that her daughter had suffered a stroke and was not coming home, a call she now understood had been a performance delivered by the man responsible for her daughter's death, sat in that courtroom and watched the verdict be recorded. Frank Mebane III, who had testified about learning his daughter was gone, about the years of strange communications and the bureaucratic explanations that had prevented a proper farewell, saw his son-in-law led away in handcuffs. There is no sentence that restores what was taken, no verdict that returns the years Mindi spent confined to motel rooms, living inside a story designed to keep her compliant and isolated, no legal finding that gives back the podcast she was building, the family she had wanted, the friendships that were slowly severed by a man who understood that isolation is most effective when it is gradual. The Compelling Women podcast exists in digital archives, Mindi's voice still audible in the recording she made before her world contracted to the dimensions Nicholas allowed it. In the final episode of the first season, she promised her listeners she would be back with another season as soon as she could. She never got to make it. What her friends have asked for, consistently, in every interview and courtroom appearance and public statement since her identification, is simple. They want Mindi Kassotis to be remembered not as a victim defined by the manner of her death, but as a woman who saw something worth celebrating in other people and built a platform to celebrate it. A woman with a master's degree and a sense of humor that lit up rooms. A woman whose former professor, decades after teaching her, could not read news coverage of her death without feeling that something essential was missing from every account because every account described what had been done to her, and none of them described who she was. This documentary has tried to do both, because the full truth of what happened in Liberty County, Georgia, in late November 2022 requires holding both things at once. The darkness of what Nicholas Kassotis did, and the brightness of the person he did it to. Her name was Mindi Mebane Kassotis. She was 40 years old. She was a writer, a podcaster, a master's graduate, and by every account of every person who knew her, someone who made the people around her feel seen. That is who she was. That is who she remains.